the first pasuk on Mishpatim, the 5 words. Ve'ela Mishpatim shatosim lifneim. The Baal HaTurim writes, Asher tosim lifneim, the gematria dikduke haTorah dikduke hasofim. Meaning that it has to conform with all the dikdukim, all the nuances of what the halacha is. Like we said yesterday, if you have 2 laws which are identical, the non-Jewish court, the secular court, gives the exact same ruling in this particular situation. You're not permitted to go there. It's only Asher Tosam Lefneim. And Rashi explains that if you go before Erkos, what are you doing? Shemevdi Yisrael Lefnei Ovid Gochovim Mazos Mechalas Hashem Umeker Hashem Alilim Vashbichom. You desecrate the name of Hashem, and you give value to the idolatry to give them a status of praiseworthiness. If you go to a secular court, even if the law is identical to the Jewish law, we really didn't explain it fully yesterday. But again, it says Asher Tosim Lefneim Dikduke Torah Dikduke Sofrim, meaning the Jewish law has to meet all the nuances of what the Torah dictates. Now, we'd mentioned, the Gemara says, a secular court, to find a person guilty, it's sufficient to have 1 judge. It's sufficient to have 1 witness, and even if the witness is related, the witness is not disqualified. Within Jewish law, you must have 3 dayanim, 3 judges. The judges must have a certain level of of qualification. You must have 2 witnesses, and the 2 witnesses, if they're related, they're not qualified to testify. It's not considered evidence. So the law is identical. You steal, you must pay, but you need evidence. And the dayan must give that verdict. So what's the verdict based upon? It's based upon evidence. And who adjudicates it? You must have 3 dayan who meet a certain criteria. You have to be smuchim. They have to be ordained. And the ordination has to be the ordination from Moshe Rabbeinu. Okay? So now, how do we get to the conclusion? Everything's based on evidence. The Gemara tells us in Sanhedrin, based on the pasuk Elokim Nitzav B'das Kale, every time a court sits in judgment, Hashem convenes with them. Now, the question we always ask is, there's always a possibility of human error. Maybe the judges, they overlooked something. They didn't notice something. Even if you interrogate the witnesses, you still can have Edom Zomim. If you have Edom Zomim, if that's the case, you gave lashes to a person that didn't deserve lashes, and you put to death a person who was innocent. So we explain, no, that the Torah says that if you meet all the criteria, which is put forth by the Torah, Elokim Nitzav B'das Kale, the verdict is the verdict the judges see through the eyes of Hashem. Hashem is a partner in that verdict. That's Elokim Nitzav B'das Kale. So every verdict is a verdict which is absolute truth. Just as we say that Hashem's judgment is emes, the judgment of the court, the verdict has to be truth. But how could it be absolute truth? You don't know. There's always human error. The answer is, if you follow the protocols which set forth by the Torah, the Dikdukei Torah, the verdict is true. But the man may be innocent. He may be innocent in this particular situation, but Hashem wanted him to die. He's not dying because he necessarily committed murder, because afterwards it's found out through Edom Zomim that the witnesses were conspiring, but nevertheless he deserved to die. So it's not you put an innocent man to death. He died because Hashem wanted him to die. You paid the money or whatever it was, or you received the lashes because you deserve that level of pain. So as a result of that, if you go to a secular court and they give the same ruling, Why do you give veracity to that ruling? The answer is because, like we have lahavdil and lakim nitzav deskel, that the judges were not concerned about human error because of their level of relation with Hashem, and Hashem allows them to see it correctly because you see it through God's eyes. So the second court, how do you know their verdict is correct? They have their beliefs. We believe we're our judgment, our verdict is correct. So by going to them, what are you saying? We don't need Hashem to be involved in our verdict to see it through his eyes. We could see it through the Gentiles' eyes. But automatically, by saying that, you're giving special acclaim and special value to the idolatry. Because what they represent, they don't represent what we represent. Because, you only see something through God's eyes only if it's Adat Elkim Nitzav Das Kale. Adas Kale is only if you're a Jewish court. That's when Hashem is associated with that verdict. If it's not a Jewish court meeting its criteria, God's not associated with that verdict. Therefore, it's considered Chil Hashem. By going to a second court, that's a Chil Hashem. For that reason. See, over here he says, the Balaturim, in this pasuk, there are five words. The first pasuk of the parsha, so he says, Yesh pasuk Hey Tevos Lomaloch, called Don Din Emes Labito. A person who renders a judgment which is absolutely true, Kilu Kiyim Hey Chabishachum Torah. It's like you fulfill the Torah its entirety. And we mentioned, and you're God's partner in creation. If you render a judgment, which is emes labito. Emes labito, Tosfos explains in Shabbos, and Sanhedrin, there's not even a question. What we call a din meruma. Din meruma means that you meet all the criteria of what the court has to meet, but the judges are not comfortable with the psak. They have a certain sense that something is not right. The witnesses may be lying, even after you interrogate them. There's something not right. If the judges feel this way, they have to what? They have to remove themselves from the case, and it has to be adjudicated over again. Why? Because it's not emes lamito. It has to be truthful on the absolute level. And the Gemara says, Ein l'dayin ela masha'enav ros. A dayan only rules based on what his eyes see. Meaning, you as a human being, if you sense it's correct and you meet all the criteria, you go for it. The Torah allows you to go for it. And Hashem will be associated with that. But if you have a sense it's not right, then you can't go for it. You can't follow through, although you met all the criteria. Because if you have a sense it's not truthful, you're not permitted to rule on that, because Hashem is only associated with something which is truth on an absolute level. This is the understanding. So the first pasuk has 5 words. It's Kilukim Chamishachum Shitorah. What's Kilukim Chamishachum Shitorah? The Mishnah tells us in the Dorim, cites a pasuk, in Brisiyam V'loil Chuk Shemaim V'ord Samti, that if my bris is in effect day and night continuously, the world exists. And therefore the Gemara says that if Torah has to be studied continuously, the Torah, it maintains existence. If there should be a lapse of Torah in the world with no one studying, the world reverts back to pre-existence. Hadon did emes lamito, the judge who renders this truthful judgment, it's Kilukim Chamisha Chumshi Torah. The world stands on the Chamisha Chumshi Torah. That's the Brisi. Last week's parsha, it's the first time I ever saw it, even though I learned many times that Rashi, over there it says that Yisro saw Moshe adjudicating and dealing with the cases of the people Mitboka Ad Erev, from morning till night. So Rashi asks, maybe the Midrash, but the court doesn't convene a whole day. It's only during the first 6 hours of the day. Then the court closes down. So what does it mean? He adjudicated Mitboka Erev. So Rashi says, if you take a look in Rashi, that a judge who renders a correct judgment, Hashem values it as if you study Torah from morning to night. Now, what does that mean? It's as if you study Torah from morning to night. That's in Lo Brisi Yom V'Loilo. If you study Torah continuously, Hashem maintains this world. Because if there's any lapse for a moment, the world reverts back to pre-existence. Rendering a judgment for even one moment, that the value of that is the equivalent of studying Torah all day, from morning to night. That's Brisi. So that's exactly, it's very good with the Balaturim. The 5 words in this first pasuk, Ela Mishpatim, that one judgment which is rendered truthfully, that's Chabishachum Torah. What does the world stand on? The world stands on Chabishachum Torah. But normally you have to study continuously. One moment of a truthful judgment is the equivalent of studying all day long. We read at the beginning of Bereshis, originally God's intent was to create the world with Midas Hadin, with the attribute of judgment. What's just judgment? Justice, precise exactness. When Hashem saw the world couldn't survive it, because nobody's perfect enough, so then he coalesced it to Midas Harachmim. But what's the value of being precise and being exact? What is the value of that? That means that whatever exists within a context of perfection. Everything's precision, precise. So although we can't survive divine justice, but Hashem says minimally you have to have human justice, terrestrial justice, and it's given over to the human courts, to the Jewish courts. So that's what the Medrash says. If the terrestrial court follows through and meets all the criteria of din shel malo, which is sufficient, because if all those laws allow the court to set the world in balance on that precise level, so then there's no reason to have divine justice. If there's divine justice, the world will be destroyed. Terrestrial justice allows the world, and that's precise, because the Torah is precise. It's the equivalent of Chemish Torah. Just that there's a law, you're not permitted to add to the Torah or detract from the Torah. There's Baltos and Baltigra. Why? Because Torah is Hashem Temimo. Because the Torah is perfect. The Chamisha Chumshi Torah, what? That's perfect. That's precise. So if the court functions within Chamisha Chumshi Torah, the world continues. Because that's Din Shal Mato. The way we live in this world and fulfill the Torah as prescribed by the Torah, we maintain existence. You start compromising the Torah, existence goes off balance. So the Eila Mishpatim, Asher Tosim Lefneim, that's Chamisha Chumshi Torah. The 5 words correspond to the Chamisha Chumshi Torah for that reason. Well, either it was Rav Huna, Rav Asi, or maybe Rav Kano, that before he passed away, he was like very upset. He was crying. So his nephew says to him, "Why are you crying? You have Torah, you have students, you did so much." He says, "Yes, I may have done all that, but you know what I didn't do? I removed myself. I didn't allow myself to adjudicate cases." So they said, "And so what?" He says, "No, because I was able, based on my ability, my acumen in Torah, I was able to do things other people couldn't do. And therefore, the judgments that were given may have not been at the level they should have been. And therefore, I'll be held accountable for not entering into that area to adjudicate it. Since therefore, that's why I'm worried. I'm worried that I fell short of what my responsibility was. I could have been a dayan, and I chose to remove myself from that and not get involved."
This was Rav Ashi.
I'll look up the measures. I'll tell you who it is in a second. Beila Mishpotim. Melech b'mishpat Yamid Oretz. The king, through justice, he establishes the land. Vish trumas yarsena. But a person who's trumos, he destroys the land. What does this mean? What's Melech b'mishpat Yam? Who's the Melech? Malka shel Torah. The king, the Talmud Chacham is considered the Malka shel. He's like the king. The Mishin Shu Oser, by rendering mishpat, Maber Oretz, he establishes. We know that one of the underpinnings of the world is what is mishpat. The ish trumas yarsena. What does that mean? In meis matzmo kitruma hazu. But if you behave like your truma, what do you do with truma? You put it in a corner to preserve it, not to become contaminated. Shemushlachs b'zavis habayis, which lies in the corner of the house. What do I have to get involved and burden myself with the needs of the community? Mali b'dineim. What do I have to get involved in? Adjudicating, Mali Lishma Kolam, do I have to hear their complaints? Shomalai Nafshi, let me live in peace. I'll learn my Torah. I'll have my Talmidim. I won't be involved with the community. That person, by removing himself where he could be involved, he's the cause of the world being destroyed because he has the ability to uphold the world, to have mishpat. By him removing himself, he's denying the world mishpat. Havi Ishtrumas Tarsena Masa Ravasi, not Ravashi, Ravasi. Shoyim Stalkim in Olam, he was about to pass away. Nichlas ben Achosu Etzlo, his nephew comes to pay a sick visit before Motzo Bocher, and he finds his uncle is crying. Omalo Rebbe, he says to his uncle, Rebbe, why are you crying? Is there any Torah that you studied that you disseminated? Your students are sitting before you. You mentored endless students. Is there any Gemilas Chesed that you didn't do? He says, and what was special about you, you didn't enter into the area of being a dayan. You didn't want to be a dayan. And you didn't want to be put in the position to assume any responsibility for communal responsibility. Omalo. So Ravasi says to his nephew, that's exactly why I'm crying. Because maybe there's going to be retribution against me. Because I could have entered into that area and adjudicated the laws of Yisrael. Having these Truma, I'm like the Truma, I went into the corner and I did not get involved. And because I should have been involved, I wasn't involved, there's going to be an accountability. That's what I'm worried about. So this is Chamisha Chumshei Torah. Ela Mishpatim, being in a position to guarantee that, as he says, Melech b'mishpat yama, only the person who's that great Talmud Chacham, does he have that ability, that's Malchus Shel Torah, to render judgments that meet the criteria of what Midas Adin is on a terrestrial, on a human level. Because if it's not, if it's compromised, then there's what? There's Din Shel Malo, which is what? Which brings about the destruction of the world. Occasions. Although today we no longer have a Sanhedrin, and we don't have the 4 death penalties, but the 4 death penalties are in effect. For instance, the Gemara says, what is skila? Skila is they put a person on a platform, the equivalent of his own height, they tie his hands and feet, his hands behind him, his feet, and they push him off backwards. And when they push him off, he falls. So usually when a person falls and he's not able to brace his fall, what happens? He breaks his neck. That's skila. And then afterwards, they put a stone on his chest. Okay? So what today we have no business. So if a person is liable for skila, how is it implemented? The person falls off a roof and he falls to his death. If he's liable for chenek, strangulation, he drowns. Drowning is chenek. Or he dies of smoke inhalation. What about if he's chay of sreifa, which at one time was molten lead? He's bitten by a venomous snake, and the venom goes through his system, and that's how he dies. So we have the equivalent of that. So if a person falls off a roof and dies, you can ask him, why did he die? He was such a tzaddik. Evidently, if he died because God wanted him to fall off the roof, and he should be bitten by the snake, and he should drown, whatever it is, right? We say a bracha dayan emes. What's dayan emes? We have no idea why, but God is the true judge, and there's no iniquity in His justice. Do we know why? We don't have to know. But one thing we know, it's din emes. You find the Adam to be Adam Zomim. So the basis why he was put to death is false. But that he was put to death, that's din emes. That's Elokim Nitza B'Daskel. That's the understanding.
Rabbi.
Yes, Jay.
So-
Good. Ernie, ask the question.
So shouldn't the Torah have dictated how cases are adjudicated if they're absolute emes and straight from HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Why did Yisro tell Moshe how to set it up?
Okay, we find that the laws of inheritance, initially, there was no slavchut, right? Slavchut was put to death in the desert. There's a question why. We have the Gemara. Either he went and he reaped on Shabbos, cut wood, or he gathered wood. So there was a question, there were daughters, and does a daughter inherit? Maybe only sons inherit, they're not heirs. And they presented the case to Moshe Rabbeinu. And it says they merited, although Moshe Rabbeinu had that direct connection, but they merited that the halacha should come to light through them. That's Megalus Chus Hayidei Zakai, because they were meritorious. Hashem allowed it to come through them, but ultimately the law was Hashem's law. Yisro, he made a suggestion, and what was the basis of the section? Because he said to Moshe, "Novel people, if you're going to follow this path, you're going to wither. It's not going to. You can't continue this way. What you're doing now is okay. You'll have truth, but ultimately it can't continue. So I suggest you should have a judicial system. But the Medrash says that even if Yisro wouldn't have suggested it, Hashem didn't yet say it yet. But ultimately it was going to come to that. Except he preempted it. He understood already what has to be done, which ultimately Hashem would have done on his own. Okay? So the concept is an easy concept. So we explained why Moshe didn't understand. Moshe understood novelty. He understood it. But he felt that for the time being, for the people coming before him and being exposed to him, his dimension of being, the effect and the impression and the level of positiveness, there's nothing equal to that. So even he will wither. It can't last, but as long as it lasts, the value is eternal value, and there's nothing which is the equivalent of that value. And then, because Moshe knew eventually he's going to have to, you have to set up a judicial system. But Jesus says even sooner. And that's what was done sooner, but Hashem would have done it in either case. And Moshe understood it had to be done.
Rabbi, in Devarim, doesn't Moshe...
The court had to convene on the temple, alongside the sanctuary. That's what it took juxtaposes Eila Mishpatim to the Mizbeach, the building of the Mizbeach in the previous parsha. So we'd said there's a halacha, there's a law, the Gemara tells us Ein Shvus b'Mikdosh, right? Rabbinical fences, many of them have no application in the Beis HaMikdash. They were below the shofar in the Beis HaMikdash. When Rosh Hashanah fall out on Shabbos, they would take the lulav. People on the Temple Mount, they would take the lulav on Shabbos, and we weren't concerned that he may transport it to be taught how to wave the lulav or how to blow the shofar. Now, what is every fence? Every fence very often is that when you get caught up in something, you lose sight of the moment, and therefore you cross many lines that you didn't cross. It's a lack of cognizance. What is a fence? A fence, they say fences make good neighbors. Makes good neighbors, okay? A fence, if you have a road, you can have an eight lane highway. You have a guardrail. Because since a person may lose cognizance of the moment, he go off to the side, and if he has the guardrail there, it protects him from going off the road. A fence keeps you in line. But why do you have to be kept in line? Because a person doesn't always have cognizance at that special level that he's aware what he's doing every moment. When you were in the Beis HaMikdash or the Mishkan, you had a sense of Hashem's presence that never for a moment did you forget exactly where you were. It brought about that sense of what? Of cognizance. So if you have that level of cognizance, you don't need the fence. That's the reason why Ein Shvus b'Mikdash. Chazal said when they legislated fences, they said most fences have no application in the Beis HaMikdash because the fence is only because of a lack of what? Of clarity. And the lack of clarity is cognizance, but since the Beis HaMikdash, you have a sense of Hashem's presence, therefore, that's why the fence is not in effect in the Beis HaMikdash or the Mishkan. Now, David Melech says, Reishis Chochmah Yiras Hashem. The prerequisite to wisdom is fear of God. Let's say you have a person with an advanced IQ. He believes he sees it right, but who is he beholding to? What's his guide to understand whether it is or whether it's not? If you have Yiras Hashem and you understand there's a level of accountability, then that keeps you on that straight and narrow path. Otherwise, you feel what I believe, what I say, I believe it's the truth. There's no accountability. But if once there's accountability, is the Yiras Hashem, Reishis Yiras Hashem, now the Chochmah is applied in a correct context. Otherwise, you believe it's correct because you're a chacham. But if it's based upon rashis, chachma, yiras Hashem, that chachma is chachma. Now, to be qualified to be a dayan, to be on the Sanhedrin, especially the Sanhedrin Gedola, the High Court, how many languages did you have to understand? 70 languages. You had to be proficient in all aspects of the Torah. You had to be proficient in every type of idolatry, witchcraft, everything, because you have to adjudicate every kind of case. What level of knowledge do these people have? We can't even relate to a level of genius these people were. Mordechai was a member of the Sanhedrin. And that's the reason when he overheard the conversation, Bigson Visherish, when they wanted to assassinate, to poison Achashverosh, he understood the language. So Gemara says, why? Because since he was a member of the Sanhedrin, they believed nobody would understand the language because they came from some far-off land. But because he was a member of the Sanhedrin, he understood the language. So what level of genius do these people have? Therefore, the High Court, where do they convene? On the Temple Mount, right in by the Azorah, by the sanctuary. Because if they don't have that sense of presence of Hashem, automatically, they'll be out of control. As a result of that, where do they convene? They have to be by the Mizbeach. Because when you're by the Mizbeach, you understand that's the ultimate level of Reishis Chachma Yiras Hashem, and that keeps him on that straight and narrow path. So I was thinking, there's a famous word from Reb Shlomo Salanter. He says, when a Jew speaks Lashon Hara in Vilna, another Jew is Mechala Shabbos and Brisk. You ever hear that statement? We've said it in the past. Meaning we have a system. When the system starts faltering, it goes from bad to worse. Meaning all Jews are one entity. We say that if the High Court is in session on the Temple Mount, the lower courts of 23 could render judgments of the death penalty. If they're not in session on the Temple Mount, the lower courts cannot render verdicts of death penalty. There's a linkage. Why? The answer is that because they only merit the siyata d'shmaya. To be able to have that relevance to truth, it's all based upon the Sanhedrin Gedola, where they are directly connected and they have that cognizance because they're present, they're in God's presence at that level. When they merit that level of siyata d'shmaya, because they have that cognizance, they have that Reishis Chachma Yiras Hashem, they automatically, the lower courts, they merit that siyata d'shmaya. That's the linkage over here. Testify in a capital case, they would say to them, do you realize, Adam Rishon was created as a single individual. Every species was created with a partner, male and female. Why was Adam created as a lone individual? Because a person has to understand Bishvili Nivra Olam. The value of one human being is the whole world is worthwhile to be created just for him alone. That's the innate value of a human being. So if you have any question regarding this man's guilt, you have to what? You have to disqualify yourself from the case. Because the consequences of a testimony will take the life of a human being. So that's why when you save the life of one Jew, it's like saving the whole world. It's based on that Mishnah. That's what the Mishnah says. So because it has such a level of responsibility, you have to merit the ultimate level of siyata d'shmaya. Monetary money you make, you lose. You can be reimbursed. Malchus is pain. That's lashes. Death, once you take a person's life, you can't bring him back. As a result of that, that's why only if the High Court is in session on the Temple Mount and they have that level of connection, that level of cognizance, that relevance to truth, then the lower courts, they merit that same level of siyata d'shmaya to be able to issue verdicts regarding the death penalty for that reason. That's last week's parsha. In Yisro, it says, Avdei Paro. A Jew is not permitted to sell himself in slavery. We are Avdei Hashem. We're God's servants. So a person who's God's servant, does he allow himself to be the servant, of a slave? It's a disrespect to the master. If I'm the slave of a master and I go and become the slave of a slave, it's a disrespect to the master. And that's avodah hevelo avodim lavodim. A Jew is not permitted to sell himself into slavery or to do something that he actually is subject to slavery. So we said in last week's parsha, and Rashi makes it a point in name of Chazal, we were avdei paro. So Rashi says we were the avodim of a king. We were never avodim of slaves. Even in Egypt, when we were avodim, we were the slaves of Paro. We were avdei paro. Hashem, we went from avdei paro, we became the avdei Hashem. But the Jew was never the slave of an ordinary person. So I asked the question, what do you mean? We have masters, the citizenry, we the slaves of the citizenry. Right? We did that back in calling. They put us through, they tortured us. They whatever they did to us. So what I said was, and what we said in the past, during the famine, what did Yosef do? For food, ultimately, after they exhausted all their finances and they had no longer any material means, what did they do? They said, we will sell our land and our bodies to the government. They all became GIs. They became government issues. Every Egyptian citizen became the chattel of the king. So when you worked for the ordinary Egyptian, who are you working for? You're working for Paro. Yosef's genius, what he did was, the Jews were never slaves of slaves. When we were subject to the whatever it is, to be controlled by the citizenry represented the king. They weren't independent. They weren't independent contractors. They were doing the bidding of the king. Therefore, we were avdei paro, but we only avdei paro because of what Yosef had done. And as a result of that, Hashem says, a Jew is not permitted to sell himself as a slave to a mortal, because you're the slaves of a king. Once you're the slaves of God, you went from royalty to the ultimate royalty. And now the Torah speaks of Kisikna Eved Ivri. A person goes and you purchase a Jewish slave or a Hebrew slave. It doesn't say Kisikna Eved Yisrael, right? The appellation Yisrael is a post-Sinai appellation. What's called Eved Ivri. So the Rabbeinu Bachya says over here, why does a Jew go and cross lines? Because if you only remember and understand who you are, it's inappropriate. How do you do this? It's almost, because of who you are, it's disgraceful. It's unconscionable. How do you steal? How do you do so many things? It's only because you forgot who you are. If you would have remembered who you are, you would have never crossed that line. So therefore, he only stole because he's Eved Ivri, because he's still the Jew of the past, pre-Sinai Jew. If you don't understand, remember the Sinai experience, how God spoke to every one of you, you never fall to this level. That's Rabbeinu Bachya. Therefore, it's Kisikna Eved Ivri.
But why?
You don't classify it as Yisrael.